Hello, everyone. I am Jessica Pan, and I am currently serving as the Secretary of AASLE. It is my great honor to introduce Claudia Goldin as this year's keynote speaker for the Gregory Lecture. Claudia is the Henry Lee Professor of Economics at Harvard University and a co-director of the NBER's Gender in Economy Study Group. She is a renowned labor economist and economic historian with a list of professional accomplishments that are much too long to list here. In a nutshell, she has made seminal contributions on topics such as gender, inequality, technological change, education, and immigration, and has held top leadership and editorial positions in economics. Claudia's work has been a huge inspiration for many, including my own. And tracing her career, it is very apparent that at any given point in time, her scholarship often defines the frontier of the field. Indeed, Claudia is no stranger to pushing boundaries. She was the first tenured woman at Harvard's and UPenn's economics departments and continues to spearhead important initiatives to recruit and retain women in economics. On a more personal note, she's also very giving and finds the time to mentor younger economists. Perhaps the only other thing that excites her more than economics is her love for animals, especially golden retrievers. Claudia pioneered the study of women's role in the economy more than 4 decades ago, and very recently published a new book titled Career and Family: Women's Century-Long Journey Towards Equity. I understand that there is a very good Korean translation available and a Chinese translation that's forthcoming for for all of you who are interested. And I am very delighted that she will be sharing some of that work with us today. Claudia will speak for about 45 minutes, and we will have a 10-minute Q&A session at the end. Please feel free to send questions through the chat. So I will be monitoring the chat and collating questions, or feel free to also use the raise hand function during the Q&A session. Without further ado, then over to you, Claudia.
Thanks very much, Jessica. I'm going to share the screen, and I hope that you, Jessica, will let me know if there's any problem with it. Okay, so share. And now I'm going to put it in full view.
That looks great so far. Perfect.
Is it okay?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, wonderful. Just get, okay. So thanks very much. I am so sorry that I can't be in Beijing. I'm so sorry that I can't be with Christian and Jessica. These are very, very good friends and people who I love to see. And I am delighted to be here today to give the Bob Gregory Lecture. So Bob is one of the founders of the Society. And he is a giant in his field, and he is a giant in terms of being a friend. And I suspect that all of Bob's friends, and I hope there are many in the audience, have fond stories about him. And I am no exception. And as you can see in this picture, well, you can't tell in this picture that it was 20 years ago. Maybe you can tell because Larry is a bit gray now. So about 20 years ago, Larry and I went to Australia at the invitation of the Reserve Bank and Bob. And you can see Bob in the photo over here. That's clearly Bob. I just wanted to make certain that you knew that we were actually there. And you can also see on the other side, Larry looking extremely lost in an Aboriginal art forest that we went to. Now, when we went to Canberra, and Bob is very proud of his city and his country, and he took us for a tour of the government buildings. And he was so excited about showing us the magnificent Parliament building, which is in the center at the bottom, that that when he drove into the building, he actually drove down the up ramp into the parking garage some 2 levels below ground. We're talking about driving into a major government building going the wrong way for a pretty long distance. And so that's Bob's car, as you can see in the blue, and in the red car, that's the Australian Federal Police. they never caught up with us. So thank you, Bob, always for showing people a great time, never a dull moment with Bob Gregory. So my talk today is going to traverse 120 years from the time college graduate women were able to have either a family or a career to now, when many anticipate in the US and in many other countries that women will have both a family and a career. And as we have moved into a hybrid era that we're experiencing right now, that I will call ACDC, or after COVID, but still during COVID, we have, at least in the US, amazingly enough, embraced the possibility of real change in the workplace and also in caregiving, which many other countries have already embraced. And I'm going to take you on a journey of discovery from then until now. And the journey is going to wind up when more women than men in the US and in many countries are graduating college, and when about the same fractions are achieving advanced or professional degrees. But while there's great similarity in ambitions, there's less similarity in eventual achievements. And the reason for this largely concerns the concept of greedy work and the relationship between gender inequality and couple inequity, or between gender equality and couple equity. So these are two sides of the same issue, or we might say of the same coin, for heterosexual couples. Same-sex couples can have couple inequity, and often do, but they will not produce gender inequality. So think about it this way. When heterosexual couples give up couple equity, they increase gender inequality. And I'm going to do a bit of work to explain exactly what I mean by that. But let me just clarify a couple of things first. First of all, my work and my book concerns college graduate women because they have had the greatest opportunity to achieve what I'm calling career, even when their numbers were low. And the second point is that career is different from a job. Career is achieved over time. In English, as well as other languages derived from Latin, the word career is derived from the Latin root to mean to run a race. The word chariot, the word carriage come from the same root. A job is more of a spot position, meaning to earn a living. So aspirations and achievements of college graduate women across the 120 years that I'm going to traverse here greatly changed. And the reason for the changes vary with the period. The labor market shifted its demands from demanding more brawn work to demanding brain work over time. Many technologies changed. They changed over this long period of time in the home, with increases, obviously, in big things like electricity and clean water and central heating. And much later, there were greatly improved fertility controls that enabled women to delay marriage and delay childbearing. But the way work is structured and the persistence of social norms, no matter how much weaker they've become, mean a lower ability for women to attain both career and family. The groups of college graduate women that I'm going to tell you about, and these are in the US, where a college graduation for women does go pretty far back. So the groups of the college graduate women form what I'll call a succession of generations, each sort of metaphorically passing a baton from one to the next with its warnings and with its advice. And there are 5 groups of women that I'm going to introduce you to. The first graduated college from around 1900 to 1919, the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and it achieved what I describe as family or career. Very rarely, as we'll see, could they have both. The second was more of a transition generation between one that had very few children and low marriage rates to one that had many children, or a very large fraction had children. Also, they did have many children, and high marriage rates. And this third group was the subject of a very famous book called The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And it graduated college, this group, from around 1946 to 1965, after World War II to the mid-1960s. It achieved family and then job. And the fourth group, which is my generation, graduated college from the mid-1960s to the late 1970s, and it attempted to have career and then family, but it didn't always have the latter that successfully. And the fifth is the most recent group, desiring career and family. I'm going to provide a bit more detail on each of these. And the detail will concern the fraction never married by 2 ages younger and older, the fraction with no children by age 45, and labor force participation work, if ever married, employment at that time when they were younger and when they were in their late 40s. So what we're going to see is somewhat of a U-shape to marriage and children. The earliest groups, group 1 and 2, we're going to see had very high non-marriage rates and a high fraction without children. This is sort of just like what has been written about in Asia today, the gold mist phenomenon that Jisoo Hwang, who's in Korea, has written a brilliant piece about. The middle group, group 3, had high marriage rates and high childbirth rates. And the most recent group, group 5, has had delayed marriage, and childbearing, which is higher than group 4, but still certainly not as high as group 3. So it's somewhat of a U shape. So to introduce you to each one of these, college graduate women in group 1 first aspired, as I said, to attain family or career. Few in this group managed both. As you can see, 50% of college graduate women, and this is the entire group, not just those who went to elite colleges, 50% never had a birth or never adopted, 32% never married. And just a small fraction were in the labor force when they were young and when they were older. In group 2, more college women aspire to have careers, but the Great Depression occurred and they didn't. Group 3, as job opportunities improved and as America was swept up in post-World War II early marriages and a baby boom that we have never seen after and we never saw before, college women shifted to planning for family first and then a job. You can see the huge changes. Just 9% of the group never married, 18% never had a birth, over 90% had children among those who ever married. This was a true baby boom, even among the college graduate group. Their employment, as you can see, was relatively low when they were young, but it greatly increased to almost 3/4 when the kids were older. This was progressive change since they found a way to have both a job and a family, and even at times a career and a family. Career, then family, became the goal for many in group 4. And this group delayed marriage and children for career. They had very high work rates when they were young. For group 4, the pill and its dissemination to young single women by the end of the 60s, the start of the 1970s, that enabled them to delay marriage and family and help boost their investment in career. But the biological clock ran out on many in this group, and 27%, as you just saw before, never had children. And as this Liechtenstein print reminds us, some forgot to have the kids. Group 5, looking back at group 4, has said, we want career and we want family. And you can see that just 21% in this group, and this is, of course, before the pandemic has reduced births among all individuals in the US. So you can see that that group 5, even though they're still delaying marriage and delaying births, have had higher birth rates than group 4. And in part, that's due to yet another technological advance, a set of technological advances that we group together and call assisted reproduction technologies. So to review, the 120-year transition from career or family to career and family here is bookended with 2 American women who served in Congress, beginning with Jeannette Rankin, the first woman elected to U.S. federal office. She was absolutely typical of the career portion of her group. She never married, she never had kids, but she had a pretty amazing career. And at the other side is Tammy Duckworth, the first senator to have a baby while holding office, the first to bring a baby into an active session of Congress, although in the US, most of us believe that there have always been babies in Congress. And you can see Betty Friedan looking rather coquettish in the middle. You may be thinking that because there were large increases in college graduation, that most of the difference across these groups concerns selection. The surprising finding is that selection is not that important. In fact, the elite, I can show, changed along with what we would call the ordinary people, the hoi polloi. Okay, now an important accompaniment to the transition across the groups has been changes in customs and norms. And the General Social Survey has, for some time, asked respondents whether they believed children would likely suffer if their mothers worked. And the answers here are graphed. The horizontal axis is the birth year of the individuals and the respondents, and the vertical axis is the fraction who said that they believed that children would likely suffer. And you can see here that agreement decreased for both men and women over time without any real new evidence of whether kids would suffer. The response changed and fewer agreed with the notion that children would be harmed. The older norm became more expensive to sustain, we can think, as the earnings of women increased. Now, how did the achievement of these women change in terms of career and family across these groups? And to compute this, I need definitions, and any definition is going to have its critics. Very simply, I define family as just having a child, biological or adopted. It does not require a husband. And Jessica said that I am a lover of dogs, and dogs don't count here in terms of children, sorry. Career is more complicated and is achieved by exceeding some level of income for 3 years in each of the 5-year periods that I'm going to show. And I'm going to provide rates of success for group 3, 4, 5, and 5+, which is the most recent group to reach their 30s, for 2 age groups late 30s, and early 50s. And the bottom line that I want you to take away from this is that career and family success greatly increased both within each group as it aged and across groups. Even though women's success today has greatly improved, though, it is still just about 60% the rate of men. So to show you what that looks like, the success rate for group 3 is here. It was abysmal. Just 5% had both career and family by their late 30s. About 20% did by their early 50s. For group 4, there was increased career success rates to about 15% when they were young and about 27% when they were older. For group 5, it was about 23% success rate when it was young and about 1/3 when it was older. And finally, we can get, for group 5 plus here, the latest group that we can track to their late 30s, it has done even better with rates around 27%, but that's still just 60% of the male rate. So even though a succession of women has made progress through this journey, women's careers still often take a back seat to those of their spouses. The most recent group has expressed its frustrations and has placed the blame on discrimination and managerial bias and pay inequity and sexual harassment. And to measure the level of discontent over time, I've used counts of phrases in newspapers, and here they are for the New York Times. There are, as you can see, two big waves. The first in the 1970s, and this was the era of a very noisy revolution in the US. And the second in the 2010s, which is the period of the Me Too movement. But as each group progressed and passed this metaphorical baton from one to the next, and as actual barriers fell over time, such as the end of marriage bars and nepotism bans, and as social norms, as we just saw, changed, the real underlying problem was revealed. There's no question that there is classic discrimination, that there are bad actors, that there are biased workers, and that there are biased supervisors. But most of the difference in earnings is due to something else. And that something else is what I call the new problem with no name, to paraphrase Betty Friedan. It is the notion of greedy work. Working more hours or particular hours leads to greater rewards, even on an hourly basis. And in upper out jobs, such as the ones that we generally have in academia, more effort today produces a greater chance to have a promotion later. But to have a family, to have children, to have elders to take care of, takes the time of at least one parent, one member of the family. There is no way to entirely contract that out. And why would you have kids if you contracted it all out anyhow? For a couple to share the joys equally is costly. So let me illustrate what I mean by that. One job here, the horizontal axis is hours and the vertical axis is earnings. One job here, think of as a flexible job, that's the red line. It has a wage that is linear here with respect to hours. The other job, the not so flexible one, is the blue line, the less flexible one. It has a wage or a slope here that rises with hours. A couple with children can't both work at the blue dot. They could both work at the red dot. And if you want to know why they can't work at the blue dot, the kids would die. They could both work at the red dot. But if they did, they would be leaving a lot of money on the table every time period. And that amount is given by the bracket. So one works at the flexible, less remunerative red job, and the other works at the less flexible, the more remunerative blue job. For many highly educated couples with children, it turns out that she's a professional who's also on call at home, and he's a professional who's also on call at the office. In consequence, he earns more than she does. And this gives rise to a gender gap in earnings. And it also produces couple inequity. So that's what I meant by the two sides of the same coin. If the flexible job could be made more productive, the difference, as you can see here, would be less, and family equity would be cheaper. Couples could purchase it and reduce the gender gap. Note that even for same-sex couples, there could still be couple inequity, but it wouldn't add to gender inequality. And even if a couple wanted what one might think of as 50-50-ness, a 50-50 relationship, high earnings for a position with less controllable hours would entice the couple to specialize. Both would have jobs. Both would have possibly even careers and very good professional jobs. But one would have the less remunerative flexible position and the other would have the higher paying, more demanding position. The point is that the gender gap in earnings is a symptom of career blockage. It's not the cause. The cause of career blockage is the high price of flexibility, or the fact that flexible jobs are perhaps less productive. Think of flexibility as an amenity at work. The amenity could be expensive, the amenity could be less expensive. Why am I so certain that the gender gap in earnings is due more to this reason than to the others that I have offered? And the reason is that it is consistent with so many other facts that we know about earnings, occupations, and family dynamics. So, what are the solutions? First, getting the correct diagnosis, knowing the problem, is the first step. It's the first step to every problem that you have, a health problem, a problem with your house, whatever it is. First, get the correct diagnosis. One solution would involve lowering the cost of flexibility, lowering the price of the amenity. That's a solution that it would involve something having to do with the production relationship. Another solution might involve altering gender norms, although that would be a lot more difficult, particularly in a place like the US and in many other places, I guess. Another solution would involve reducing the cost of childcare and elder care. So that's another price. So let me take a slightly deeper look at the first solution. How can one lower the price of flexibility? The simplest way would be to create good substitutes between workers. IT could be used to pass information and hand off clients with little loss of information and still retain great fidelity. Teams of substitutes could be created, as they have been in many high-income fields like pediatrics and anesthesiology and veterinary medicine and personal banking and many tech jobs and primary care doctors. Teams of complements, as is often the case in consulting, actually increase the cost of coordinating schedules. So the tale that I have told was set in what I call the BCE world, the BCE before the COVID era. What does it tell us about the new era? In mid-March of 2020, we all descended into what I call a DC world, a during COVID world. Those who could sheltered in place. Those who could worked from home. Fortunate children had online schooling and at-home help. Parental childcare time doubled. In the age of what I call ACDC, meaning after COVID, but still during COVID, that's the world that we're sort of still in. Schools are open, but childcare time is still higher than before. I was just reading in the New York Times that in the US, some public schools are closing on Fridays to make certain that the teachers don't leave the job of teaching. So even with schools open, childcare time is still higher. A silver lining to this year that we have spent in the US and elsewhere in what I would call in exile, a silver lining to this dreadful year and a half now is that we have finally begun in the US a national dialogue about caregiving. In the US, we had this conversation long ago in 1943 when we desperately needed women, non-working mothers, to help on the home front. In the US, we actually created subsidized preschools in 1943 that were open from early morning to evening. Women are now almost half the labor force in the US. The US economy runs on women. Another silver lining is that we have learned to use technology to work from home. And as long as that doesn't become a female enclave, it will serve to lower the cost of flexibility. We always had the possibility of flexible jobs, but they were expensive. They weren't that productive. If one doesn't have to, let's say, go to Tokyo to do a merger and acquisition or to Beijing to sign the contract, if one doesn't have to do that, then parents, especially women, will be able to take these somewhat lucrative positions. Thus, another part of the solution is to reduce extensive travel and unnecessary meetings. I think we would all like unnecessary meetings stopped. We should enable WFH, work from home, but don't create a work from home enclave and don't make it work from hell. Make the amenity less expensive to workers by making flexible work more productive. The story I have told and was written for what I call the BCE world before the COVID era, but it's precisely what is needed for our ACDC world. So in conclusion, prior to March of 2020, in a time that I call BCE, the reasons women were being held back from achieving career and family became clearer, and clouds parted, allowing us to see what was blocking the way. What was blocking the way was, as I put it, greedy work and the relationship between gender inequality and couple inequity, or between gender equality and couple equity, the two sides of the same issue. When couples give up couple equity, they increase gender inequality for themselves and for the entire economy. So I thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions that you have.
Thanks very much, Claudia. This was a really interesting and inspiring talk. At this point, I'd like to invite any one who might have questions. Again, feel free to type in the chat box, or you can also use the raise hand function. And from my end, I would be happy to unmute you, and you can ask your question in person. It seems that Bob is also in the audience. So Bob, if you'd like to say a few words, you're more than welcome to do so.
He's going to deny that he ever drove down the wrong way.
There's Bob. Bob, let me unmute you. Give us a second. All right.
Oh,
I think
okay.
we can hear you now.
Can I say a couple of things? Can I say a couple of things? First of all, I'm echoing. Are you echoing, Jessica?
Sorry?
I'm echoing to myself here. You're not hearing that?
I think we're here. It's a little choppy, but we can hear you.
Okay. I want to say three things. First of all, I'm a bit miserable not being there. You know, this conference is such a wonderful thing, and I would love to be there, and I'd love everybody else to be there as well. The second thing I want to say is how brilliant I think Claudia is. It's unusual to find people who are on the research frontier, can deliver talks so clearly, and talk all the time about policy relevance as well. I mean, it is really nice to hear someone whose life has been devoted to the half of people who hold up half the world. It's really good. The last thing I want to talk about quickly is how some of these things differ across countries. And I'll just make a few quick comments about Australia, which is a little different from Claudia's talk, but not very different. The first thing is that the hours gap and the flexibility has sort of been met here, in the sense that half the women in Australia work part-time, not full-time. Next, the part-time pay as a ratio of full-time pay is very, very high. And the growth of part-time over the last half century has more or less kept pace with the growth of full-time work. And the final thing I want to say, which is interesting, is that let's ask two questions. One, where do you see the big adjustment occurring in Australia among women and work? And for the last 2 or 3 decades, all the big adjustment in the labour market has been for older women, the over 45s. It's really quite dramatic, the growth of older women at work. And the other thing which is interesting about Australia, and contrasts a bit with Claudia's talk, is that we could ask the question, if you wanted to choose between men adjusting or women adjusting to this problem, who would you choose, or how would you think about this? Well, in Australia, you can see the adjustments occurring dramatically in the male labour market. In the last 2 decades, the hours gap between men and women has begun to narrow, and the hours gap is narrowing because of men's adjustment. We now have more and more men taking up part-time work. So The Australian experience poses an interesting question. Looking at the past and focusing on ours, it may well be the big adjustment is the way that men behave, rather than major changes across the board in the labour market or in women's behaviour. So thanks very much, Claudia. We did meet a long time ago in England, and it's been great to know you for so long. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. Very good points. I can see yet another reason for moving to Australia. When I went to Australia, I realized that it was absolutely heavenly and that Sydney is among the most beautiful places in the world. But let me just say a couple of things. One is that the increase in women's labor force participation in the US has been among those 55 plus. So and the reason is sort of cohort change, that those are the women who are my group 4. So they plan for not jobs, but real careers, and they're in it for the long run. And so that is, it would be interesting to look at that in other countries as well. But in a paper in a book that Larry and I edited called Women Working Longer, and I don't know if it's a description just of how much work I put into the book, that it's all of the change and all of the increase in labor force participation in the US among women is among those 55 and older. As far as men adjusting, that would be very nice. But if it is the case that the labor market is still rewarding the longer hours, and it's not just longer hours, but it's a particular hours jobs, then for men to adjust and for women to stay where they are means that couples give up a lot of money. So it's the real question is how the Australian economy and labor market managed to adjust so that there's no part-time pay penalty. I would like to see the numbers for lawyers, for doctors, for managers, for academics, to see whether in fact there isn't a part-time pay penalty. I know for pharmacists, and that's my one great example, in which there is almost no part-time pay penalty. There's really very good substitutability. But just about every other profession, there's a pretty large, and tech is much smaller as well. So Jess?
Great. Thanks so much, Claudia. Thanks, Bob, for your comments and questions. Actually, just as a follow-up, and I think it sort of relates very nicely to the point that you just made, Jung Min in the audience has a question about the point that you made about complements versus complements in teams and substitutes in teams. And I think his question is, how would you think about the productivity differences between teams of those forms? And to follow up sort of more generally, he's thinking about firms' incentives to adopt gender equity arrangements. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that this is a very good place for, we labor economists to sort of sit back and do some modeling. That we use the word teams, but teams of substitutes and teams of complements are really very different. And they're going to have different impacts on productivity and in the case that I have set up, on the ability for there to be couple equity and for women to be able to close the gap with men. So the question is, how large a group? Clearly, if you have a group of, 3 in a consulting company, and you have to figure out, can you get together? You have a much better chance of doing that and making certain that if one person's kid gets sick, that you could rearrange the meeting. A group of 10, it's going to be a lot more difficult. So I think that that's pretty clear. But so many fields have realized that teams of substitutes, you can even have substitutes within a team of complements, obviously, that having a bit of redundancy in the institution, in the corporation, is a good thing, because then you have the ability to pass on to someone else, the ability to give all the information with high fidelity if you have good, good technical assistance. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Tantan has actually 2 questions. The first is, what are your thoughts about how the boom of the gig economy might change gender inequality in the future? And the second question, which I think relates, sort of very closely to, the audience, is, as you may be aware, China has relaxed their one-child policy, and is now sort of actively encouraging women to have a 3rd child. And do you have any thoughts about how this might, affect the careers of Chinese women?
Sure. Well, the first, so let me deal with that one first, which is when I see fertility rising in Asia, I'll answer the question.
Exactly. No, I had the same thought.
Okay. So Jessica has just increased the total fertility rate in Singapore. So, so she has two children, right, Jess?
Yeah.
You have 2. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think you increased it. So when we see that happening, we'll be able to address the question. And because the point is that it's a chicken and egg problem, it's not going to happen until the women in Korea and Japan, in China, see that they are getting help, that this is affordable, and that they are going to give to the 2 or 3 children what they wanted to give to the 1 or 2 children, and that they will have their lives together when they're 45 years old. So that's a great question. And as I always say, one of the wonderful things about being an economist is that the questions never end because there's always some interesting change in the air. But with regard to that, by the way, and many in the audience know this paper, there's a great paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives from many years ago by Fire, Sacerdote, and Stern.
Stork.
Will the stork return to Japan and Europe? And that sort of goes through why it is that there's this position in development where if women are in the workforce and they're still doing everything at home, and there's little ability, little subsidization for them in terms of the labor market and government, they're going to be in control and say 1 kid or 2, certainly not 3. So that I would say go back and read that paper and think hard about it. The gig economy issues are fascinating. Now, the gig economy, there's much of the gig economy is a very low-end economy in the US. There's always been a sort of a high-end gig economy, like journalists. How many of you have been called up by someone who essentially works for 3 newspapers and also has a podcast and has this and that? That is the professional gig worker. But by and large, professionals are not gig, high-end college educated individuals are not gig workers. Whether this is going to sweep more into that space, I will go home and ask my husband, Larry, who is more of an expert on the gig economy. Thanks.
Thank you. Claudia, yeah, I think, fertility is extremely sticky, especially in this part of the world. And I think any sort of suggestions, and ideas, and actually, I think your talk relates to, sort of many of the fundamental reasons why fertility remains low in a society where, women are trying to build careers as well. But I was going to say, yeah, many governments here will pay big bucks to try to increase fertility. So shifting gears a little bit, there's a question by Dia. To think a little bit about how would you define flexibility for women, especially in the developing country context? In particular, I think he or she raises the point that many women are actually involved in the informal sector, but the work hours is still very long hours, and there's not much difference between formal employment and informal employment. So maybe you have some thoughts about the notion of workplace flexibility in a developing country context.
Yeah, this is hard. And let me just shift gears a little bit and say that I could ask a similar question of myself having to do with the US and say, what would I say about individuals in the US who are not college graduates, who maybe just have a high school degree? What exactly is going on with regard to flexibility in their lives? And in many ways, it's pretty bad. So, so the question isn't simply whether they have there's a high cost to flexibility. It also has to do with predictability. So it's not that, so for many low wage workers, for many lower educated workers in the US, and possibly in having to do with this question, it isn't simply that you are being asked to work long hours. In fact, your problem is that you don't know whether you're going to be working tomorrow. And if you work tomorrow, will you start at 6 a.m. or will you start at 2 p.m.? And this is a horrendous issue for single moms, for sure. It's a horrendous issue for anyone with care. So my guess is that there are similar issues in all countries having to do with the informal sector. So it's a slightly different set of issues. It's sort of less whether you have a flexible job than whether you have a predictable job.
Great, thank you. So Yang Yao has a question about whether you could maybe spend a bit more time telling us about why in the graph that you showed, or the table rather, the first cohort of women had very low marriage rate and a very large portion of them never had children. So I think this is specifically
Right.
with the cohorts.
So I think that we sort of go way back to the early 20th century, and there's no place on earth where we don't have the things that we didn't have in that part of the century. So we can think that the barriers that women faced to having both a career and a family were just insurmountable. So there were barriers in terms of even in the US and in many other countries, teachers could not be married, for example. And we know that even, Marshall, when he began in Cambridge, could not be married, and he switched in Cambridge. And so he switched from Cambridge, and his then wife couldn't get a position in the university because it was male only. So I think that the barriers were just insurmountable. Plus, in the household, we didn't have the various time-saving appliances, and so I think that it was a moment when when there were just too many hurdles for there to be both.
Great, thank you. So Naitia has a question, and it's actually a bit similar to a question I also have, so I'm gonna kind of stack my question on it. So Naitia's question is the following. Could you comment on the effect of commute time on the gender wage gap? It seems like women tend to choose jobs that locate closer to home and give up jobs that pay higher wages but are further away. Do you think that COVID would reduce the gender wage gap by making work from home more possible? And I think to stack my question on, I think, sort of more broadly thinking about this work from home environment and your point about not making it a female enclave, are there sort of, good examples that might come to mind? And I think Naitia's specific example might be one instance where, as more companies are now trying to bring workers back to the office, it seems like there's a bit of resistance towards sort of fully embracing a work from home culture. And do you see that as something that might, become this potential issue where, such arrangements become a female-only kind of take up? And are there sort of good examples that you've seen around that might sort of help to sort of make this something that might actually stick?
This is an absolutely great set of questions, and I will say that it's a great set of questions rather than a great set of questions that are easy to answer. Okay, so flexibility, the changes in flexibility that we have been seeing are both temporal and geographic. In the US, for example, many people who were working and living in Silicon Valley in California, which is very expensive, have decamped to places that are really beautiful and cheap, like Idaho. So that's geographic flexibility. So we know that lots of workers have decided in firms in which the notion of complementarity of workers may be lower. So a lot of it depends upon the production relationship in the firm. But every day I read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, everything that comes my way to see what the CEOs in the US and around the world are saying about where things are going. And they don't know yet. Even by the way, and I think many people in the audience will know the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is on Mass Ave. Jim Paterba, who is the CEO and president of the NBER, still has not come up with a plan for how we're going to really open up. And so I hear all the time that, for example, in the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, city workers were told, okay, everyone has to be back in the office 5 days a week. Well, other employers are not saying that. So the city of Cambridge was faced with their workers saying, we're going to leave and go elsewhere. We don't want to commute every day. And so we are in a new world of work, and we do not know where that is going to wind up. My sense is that it's going to wind up better, that we have coordinated on a new equilibrium. We could be doing what we're doing now. We could have done it 5 years ago, but we didn't because we didn't coordinate on this new equilibrium. I can now have Jessica give a talk to my seminar and not have to come to Boston. But at the same time, we can all meet together. We may have the best of both worlds. We can meet together in the same room. Not that we're doing that right now, and bang our heads together and create more knowledge, because I think that we will miss something if we don't start doing that, for sure. And to end this important question with somewhat of an answer, yeah, it's only going to work the right way if it isn't segregated. If we segregate it by sex, if we segregate it by age, if we segregate it by whether you're a parent, it's just not going to work.
So the important thing is to make sure that the men take it up too, or have incentives to want to take it up.
Right, but it's also the case that it can't be the young. Look at it this way, even if we didn't have anything called gender, forget gender and just have
Yeah.
age.
Right,
Age
age or
wouldn't be good either, because I'm sure that you have had something to do with some company or some part of your university where you think, my God, the young people know nothing. So if the young people know nothing, we're, in really, really bad shape. The young people, be they lawyers, accountants, assistant professors, administrators, have to learn from the older people. Or shall I say the more experienced people?
All right, so that was a really great discussion. Time is almost up, but I think I have a go ahead for one last question. So this is a question about again the developing country context, and whether you have any thoughts about the with developing countries rapidly urbanizing, like China, what will be the impact of urbanization on gender inequality?
Oh, that's if Ed Glazer were in the room, I would throw it to him. The impact of urbanization on, well, let me just go back to Jessica's point before, because I think that was an excellent point. That another part of the model, the implicit model that I had for you, is that women do less well because they don't expand their horizons in terms of their geographic horizons in terms of jobs. Remember, my answer to that question was Idaho. My answer was that we've reduced the cost of geographic flexibility. Okay. Now, what cities do, my dear friend and colleague Ed Glazer has always told me that the definition of cities is essentially putting the distance between the two of us to the limit would be 0. And under those conditions, it's better for women. The denser we are, the greater ability an individual has to find a better match in terms of a job. Yeah.
Great, thank
Wonderful
you.
questions. Thank you very much, Jessica. Wonderful to see you again, and for both of you.
And huge thank you for
I'm coming back to Australia.
So you have many trips on your list. You have Australia, Beijing, Singapore. So we should start planning your Australasian tour soon. But thank you again, Claudia, for a wonderful talk, and for giving us the keynote lecture for AASLE 2021. And thank you everyone for participating. We have a great lineup of talks coming up. And so please participate actively, and I look forward to seeing everyone around. Thank you.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.